Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about David Leeming's book, Medusa in the Mirror of Time. Now, this is a reception studies text, which, so basically reception studies is the idea that at different points in history, particular materials, particular myths, stories, texts, whatever it is, have been understood in dramatically different ways. A lot of reception studies work deals with the way that later cultures understand Greek and Roman mythology, but we also have other kinds of reception studies. We have reception studies that focuses on reception of ancient Egypt, on reception of to a certain extent, sort of ancient Middle Eastern texts like the Epic of Gilgamesh, reception of medieval literature, culture, imagery, etc., etc. And so Medusa in the Mirror of Time looks specifically at Medusa, the reception of the Medusa myth. And particularly, Leeming takes a biographical approach. So essentially what he tries to do here, or what his stated purpose is here, is to give us a biography of Medusa, the story of how she has been represented throughout time. So we start with this idea at the core of reception studies, which is variety. So in the opening section of the preface, he says, "Our subject's life is described in various, sometimes conflicting, versions by several ancient myth makers and historians of myth. For interpretations of the events of Medusa's life, we can look not only to these myth makers and historians, but to ancient and modern philosophers, modern psychoanalysts, depictions of her in art and literature over the centuries, and even to her use by contemporary feminists and the advertising industry." So we get a sense of the scope that that Leeming is working with here, from actually prior even to ancient Greek sources, because while he gives us the story as it's sort of developed by ancient Greek and Roman writers, philosophers, historians, people like Hesiod, Homer, Ovid, people like this. We also have much more tentative, maybe, depictions of Medusa that predate these Greek versions. Versions of gods, goddesses, monsters with snakes for hair, gods, goddesses, monsters associated with snakes, goddesses, monsters presented visually in the artistic record in ways similar to how Medusa is presented, namely face forward as opposed to in profile, typically with her tongue stuck out, and often with fangs, wide staring eyes. So these are some of the characteristics of how Medusa is presented in Greek and Roman art, and there's a number of other either different figures or unidentified figures that predate Greco-Roman. The first evidence we have of a Greco-Roman version of the Medusa myth. So it's unclear here, and this is important, I think, to state overtly. It's unclear that these are necessarily versions of Medusa. They may be versions of other figures and components like staring eyes, the protruding tongue, fangs. These may simply be things that, across a number of cultures, represent some sort of source of terror. So this may not be that like Medusa goes back to ancient Sumeria or something like this. But we have that iconography that, at the very least, spans cultures and may remind us of Medusa. But we get to the Greek and Roman version, and Leeming gives us a sort of overview of this. There are some ways in which different Greek and Roman depictions or descriptions of Medusa vary. So, for instance, for me, one of the most important ones is around her relationship with Poseidon. So it says here, Hesiod and Apollodorus tell us that Poseidon lay with Medusa, then a young woman of great beauty. Hesiod says they lay in a beautiful meadow on a bed of flowers, but according to Ovid, the union was an act of rape that occurred in a temple of Athena. So that, it's interesting because one of the things Leeming does in this book is he assumes that there is a core version of the myth that Greek and Roman writers tend to accept, or tend to sort of generally believe. And then interestingly, he says after the Roman period, the changes to the myth that we see are illegitimate somehow. They are not a true part of Medusa's biography. And that's an interesting thing. I'll come back to that because I want to say more about that. But I think this is a really important point for me in my reading of the Medusa myth. A lot of the Greeks, again, Hesiod and Apollodorus most prominently perhaps, don't describe Medusa's relationship with Poseidon as one of rape. It's simply that they have a sexual relationship. And, I mean, again, Greek gods, Roman gods were constantly having sex with anything that moved. Medusa is in the sort of pantheon of... she's in the pantheon of monsters, not necessarily gods, but she's related to gods, or perhaps more accurately, she's a child of Titans. So she's in this same sort of general sphere of deities that Poseidon is in. But then again, Ovid says that Poseidon rapes Medusa in Athena's temple. That to me is a very different thing. So I'm a little bit on the fence about Leeming's argument, assertion, assumption that the Greek and Roman myth is somehow coherent enough that we can count it as one unified myth and exclude everything that comes after. So, after we get through that, after we get through the Greek and Roman versions of the myth, we move through the various subsequent historical periods, or Leeming takes us through them. The medieval period, the Renaissance, the Romantic era, the Age of Reason, the Modernist period, and then contemporary philosophical, psychoanalytic, feminist, and advertising. And in each of these periods, the way that Medusa is understood changes drastically. So, for instance, the Greeks and Romans conceptualized Medusa as a hideous monster. That's one of the core things that we see generally across the board. Although, interestingly, they also say that or one of the reasons offered for why Athena hates Medusa so much is because at one point Medusa compared her beauty to Athena's. So we've got a little bit of a contradiction there. But it seems, the general thing seems to be that after that comparison, Athena transforms Medusa into a hideous monster. So we'll accept that. In the medieval period, she becomes conceptualized as a temptress. Not necessarily like she's out there being all like sexy and, I don't know, Jessica Rabbit-like or whatever it is, but she's a temptress in the sense that figures like Eve, Jezebel, these sort of biblical women who somehow, in the medieval mind, destroy good, godly men, putting aside the fact that Perseus is a Greek pagan and not a good Christian man. But Medusa becomes this sort of symbol of woman as temptress, and it's a very sexist, very medieval, very patriarchal approach to the myth, but it fits in with the way that medieval morality is conceptualized. Christian medieval morality, that is. We get to the Renaissance. She changes again. She changes this time to a suffering innocent. And this is more in line, I think, with Ovid's version, because the Roman texts would have been much more familiar to people in the Renaissance than the Greek versions. And so the idea that, as we find in Ovid's Metamorphosis, that Medusa is raped by Poseidon and then punished by Athena and then murdered by Perseus, all of this stuff. Like, Medusa has not really done anything wrong in this version of the myth. And so that's the sort of thread that gets picked up in the Renaissance, and we start to see Medusa conceptualized as someone who is a suffering innocent, and therefore she becomes much more beautiful, she becomes much softer in depictions of her, etc., etc. So we get all of these different things. But ultimately, Leeming concludes that these later versions, everything after the Roman period, is a sort of illegitimate use of this myth. That it somehow abandons core essential elements of the Medusa story. And that's an interesting take. Now, this is not necessarily bad reception studies, but I disagree with Leeming's approach here because this is a myth. This is not a singular text. If it were something like the reception of Aeschylus's Oresteia or Plato's Republic, Aristophanes' Frogs, whatever it is. Sure, you could say, look, this is a concrete text, it has distinct characteristics, you can make changes to it, but those are changes from something stable. With Medusa, we don't have something stable. We have a lot of different versions of the myth, from the ancient world up through the present. And for me, I'm not as willing to sort of accept that the Greeks and Romans defined her in a specific way, and that any deviation from that is non-canonical, is unauthorized, is illegitimate in some way. I'm not really willing to accept that line of reasoning because myth continually grows, it continually develops, it continually changes for the particular cultural moment that's receiving that myth.